we can start right in. Matt, I guess for me anyway, if we could kind of walk through where we left last week, and I know there was a lot of work checking numbers with you and Bert over the past few days. Maybe that's the place to start. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, fine.
And then we have a lot of philosophy to discuss too, but I'd like to get, Roger's coming, he said he'd be here about 1:30. I'd like to get as many folks here as we could to just talk philosophy with, you know, the multipliers we apply to out of town, multipliers we apply to Breezewood, multiplier we apply to North Shores, and just kind of get that conversation going with the team to figure out what we think is the right approach for those. But in the meantime, maybe just start with what the verification of the numbers you did with Bert over the last few days.
Okay. We can talk about that. I think some of the conversations are still going on now, so we have a little bit to settle there. But what we've been trying to get a little bit more comfortable with is the number of bills that we're using in our analysis. You know, it's a number we've been focused on both the wastewater and the water side. The flow totals to use for both peak and non-peak on the wastewater side and on the water side. Now, as the group knows, because we've talked about it a lot, the data set that I've been using throughout the work that we've done with the city is a little bit older. It's an October 2016 and September 2017 data set. And from that data set, we were able to determine how many wastewater bills there were over that time frame. We were able to determine how many water bills there were over that time frame. We were able to determine the flow for both wastewater and water, both peak and non-peak over that time frame. But I wanted to understand how those numbers compared to a more recent data set. So I think I mentioned this on the last call that we had. I was going to reach out to Kevin via email about that to see if the city would be willing to dig up a little bit of data just to see how the numbers I came up with compared to the numbers that the city would come up with for a more recent data set. And we did get that information. We got some of it at least. I think some that we still have some questions going back and forth on. But I can share with you that on the wastewater side, the number of bills that I had with my data set was 10,216. And the number of bills that actually Bert was the one who spearheaded the data collection and analysis. He provided a number that was 10,740. So it was close. So that made me feel, good about the number that I came up with. And then on the water side, the number of bills I came up with was 23,072. And when Bert provided the data for that, and I think he provided it just prior to a chat that we had last week, later last week, or maybe it was early this week. I think it was early this week, actually. As soon as we started talking about that data, we realized that that number that I presented was not the number of bills per se, but it was really the number of meters that were reflective on bills because it included what was being charged for the irrigation meter as well. So we had a little bit of a discussion around that, ultimately thinking that it made sense, first pass discussion on it, but it made sense to us that if the city were to charge this ready to serve charge that we've been talking about, that it would apply to both for the water side, it would apply to both the regular meter and the irrigation meter. So therefore, we were generally okay with including the irrigation in these numbers that we were coming up with. So my number 23,072 includes irrigation. The number that Bert presented that also included irrigation was 24,488. So in the ballpark. And I think generally it makes sense that those numbers would go up, that they wouldn't go down, since the data set that I was analyzing, which is about a year and 2.5 years old now, I guess.
And then just for the others at the table who may not have realized that, because I certainly didn't, was currently the service charge of $9, I think, a quarter, whatever it is, gets applied to each of those meters. If you have an irrigation meter and your regular water meter, you get that for each of those meters. And I was not under that impression. So that was news to me, so just to share that with you in case you didn't know that.
Since they're on the same bill?
Correct, you'd get that fee twice. Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, no problem. So that made me feel a little bit better. There was a data set that I analyzed. I did a lot of data mining on it, for lack of a better term, because there were a lot of accounts that changed ownership during that time span. So I was trying to, get a sense of. It was a little difficult to nail down that build amount. So once I got that information from Bert, it made me feel better about everything. So that was good news. Then on the flow side, the email that I sent over to Kevin about this stuff requested flow for both wastewater and water, and Bert did put together some numbers for water. We haven't seen wastewater numbers yet, but put together some information for water. My total flow was about 356 million units, slightly north of that. The number that Bert came back with was 347 million, but there were some questions on whether that was accurate because there were two different usage numbers. There was an actual usage and a billed usage number that was provided. And I know Bert, we've been communicating on this a little bit the past few days, and Bert had an email he sent out to me today that explained it a little bit. I haven't had a chance to review that yet, so I'm not quite sure how accurate that number is at this point. If Bert's available, maybe you can comment on it, but.
Well, those differences that you noted, Matt, like you had a meter usage reading, it might be 3,000, and then the build would be 30,000 gallons. Some of the meters, the old mechanical meters, only have so many digits on them. So we have to enter a 10 multiplier in the billing system to compensate for that, to record the correct amount. So of those items that I sent to you that were highlighted in red on the sheet about an hour ago, most of those were meters that required a multiplier, and so the usage number would not be accurate. It's the build number was accurate because it would contain the multiplier of 10 on I think there were about 150 of those meters, 160 on that list.
Okay, so the actual usage is a number that is read in, but it might not actually be the true usage because of the multiplier.
That's right. Now, I put a column in there for you. I know you haven't had time because it wasn't sent out that long ago, but I had an adjusted column that I created in that worksheet to show you what to add the total gallons with the multiplier included.
Okay, but in short, should we be looking at the billed usage instead of the actual usage?
Generally speaking, there were a couple on there. A couple of individual accounts that I noticed that were just incorrect. They had a lot more zeros than they should have. So, and sometimes you'll have a meter that gets when service gets shut off. Sometimes that causes a distortion and then gets turned back on. So there are a few of those in there, but 90% of the items on that list were a result of the multiplier.
Okay. All right, so I'll analyze that. So I guess I'm not ready to comment on, how accurate the flow number that we're carrying right now is. It'll depend on results of this analysis. But, and then, Bert, do you think we can get the wastewater flows as well in the near future?
Sure.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we'll have a better sense of the flow numbers presumably the next time pretty accurate. And I'll show you some of the changes I've made to the workbook to allow whatever bill number should be used in the rate setting. Instead of just assuming my number, which I had been all along, it doesn't have to be that number, it really could be any number, but I've allowed that to be a configurable item now. I'll show you that in the workbook when we start looking at it. So then, the other thing, I guess, that I can think of off the top of my head that was something that we've been talking about the last few days has to do with the way that historically, the way that the enterprise funds, that would be water and wastewater, have produced a surplus in the recent past, and some of that surplus has gone over to the general fund for operations. This is something that Bert has mentioned a few times recently, including on a recent call that we had. So just to take a step back and talk about our focus, really ever since we've been working on trying to get at a rate that everyone's comfortable with, has been to try and identify what the costs are, really to operate the water operations and wastewater operations, what the costs are for that, and then back out any revenues or any non-rates revenues, any reserves that we might be using to get at the quote-unquote revenue requirement for rate, and then focus on recovering that. We've had that mentality the whole time. At no point until very recently have we talked about maybe the possibility that we should be focusing on this other piece, which is that historically the enterprise funds have taken some surplus out of the enterprise funds to help with general fund operations. So that's kind of a new element, and because we didn't want to just put that off to the side, we've actually had some discussions on it, and I've modified the workbooks both on the water and the wastewater side to include the possibility that there's some subsidy worked into what we're trying to do here. Again, it's a configurable thing. It doesn't have to be set that way. We could just set it to 0, but at least we have the possibility that it would be included, and something that is added to the cost and something that's added to the revenue requirement, so that the rate would get calculated with that piece in there if necessary. So that's another thing that we talked about recently, and something that I've made a change for in the workbooks. Just in my notes. Oh, and then, and Kevin, at some point I'm going to ask you just to make sure I haven't forgotten anything, but one other thing that we discussed last week, or actually it was early this week, feels like last week, but it was early this week, is some of the focus, I know some of the focus of recent discussions has been, I'm talking about, kind of within your community, not on our group, not as part of our group, well, as part of our group, but mostly in your community, is the fact that we're not really focused on a peak and a non-peak rate anymore. We're focused on one rate. Granted, peak flow is incorporated into that rate, so it's accounted for in some fashion. But the fact that people aren't specifically being a peak and a non-peak rate has raised some questions or concerns. I've heard comments like, well, we want to make sure that the seasonal user is paying their part, something along those lines. So one of the things that we briefly talked about earlier this week was making sure that we are presenting data that would satisfy that concern. And one thing I thought of was, well, all along in our analysis, we focused on those 8 user examples that I kind of picked out of. I wouldn't say I randomly picked them, because I didn't. I did it based on their usage, but I just picked them because their usage fell in line with what I saw as a small, medium, large, very large user for both the quarterly and the monthly users. And I've carried represent the true quote-unquote seasonal user, I don't know that. So I thought it made sense to see if we could identify a few accounts that are definitely seasonal use, to see if we could add those to our workbook and see the impact that is projected to be on them based on the rates that we have in here. That hopefully, presumably, would allow the city to use that data to satisfy that concern. So I was hopeful that at some point in the near future, someone could work with me on providing a few accounts that are definitively seasonal users so we can see what that looks like. And I would gladly add that to the workbook if I was able to get that data from the city. And all I would need to know is what account number. I have data on each account. I just need to know which account number would be a good example.
Sure. So I guess for the group, I mean, what's the definition of a seasonal user? Is that somebody that only comes in the summer, or is that someone that only comes in the winter? What would you term as seasonal user? The owner that avoids the summer because it's too busy, just comes in the winter, or
Well,
the people that avoid the winter and just come in the.
Well, I would say it would be driven by the water usage. I mean, if there's no water usage in 2 of the quarters, then
So it doesn't matter which.
Not really, I don't think we've ever looked at it that
So
way.
we can look at them because we have that data. We can just pick out some random users that have 2 months of very, very low usage and then 2 months of inappropriate use.
that's right.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. I can do that, Matt.
Yeah, and ideally they're both water and wastewater users, but they don't need to be, but hopefully they are.
Yep. Yeah, Don.
Well, are we talking about seasonal user? Are we really talking about tourists? Like, we're really trying to capture the tourists coming to town and their water usage, because they're the biggest users. So wouldn't we be, it's not like a residence, whether the people, the homeowner lives here, they're here seasonally. It's really, how do we capture the seasonal tourists? So,
But we don't collect a fee when they come across the bridge and you're gonna use this amount of water. I mean, it's coming back to one of those meters. So I
Right.
don't know how you say we're gonna,
no, somehow we have to capture or account for the tourists. I mean, we built the system for the tourists that, 75% of our flow comes through in the tourist season, and only 25% comes through in the off-season. So, I mean, it's the demand of the tourists that have defined the size of our capacity and what we're building for, so that the size of the holding tanks, the pumps, right? So, I mean, this is the whole idea of the utility, how much demand they have, and that demand driving the size, and how do you build that demand when they're here? So that's what's happening in town, and so 75% of our flow comes through when tourists are here, and the remaining 25% would be that comes through the rest of the year. That represents what homeowners use, okay? But what tourists are using are like 3 times what the normal need is for the property owners. So somehow how do we account for that huge tourist influx and that huge tourist demand that most homeowners
okay,
aren't
that's a little different than identifying the seasonal user that I think Matt was just
But
describing.
I think people's concern is it,
So if we look at,
Usage.
yeah,
well,
And we have property owners that live here year-round.
sure, you can identify that, there's a small portion of that. You can look at some vacation rental homes that are investor-owned, and their owners don't use them, they're just rented in the summer, you have some of that. But you really have to look at the businesses that.
well,
that
I think if we go back to our original discussion at day one was, we really weren't, I mean, this group's not trying to look at individual user groups. We were just trying to, what's the fair way to build this? And we can let, the board will decide, well, we want to charge summer users more than we charge our residents. That's not our charter. Our charter is to come up with a fair rate. So we're trying to do that for per gallon.
Right, and
Yeah.
I think you come up with a gallon rate, but then, I think Rehoboth's plan in the past has always been to have a peak rate. And I think that's been a very equitable structure to the rate, because recognizing that the great demand is in the summer with tourists who don't have accounts. And it's like any utility, they have to bill when the people who are using the system demand it. They have, and utilities traditionally charge the peak rates when their big users are there. Okay, that's the fair way to capture and have those users pay for the system you've created for them. Okay, so so doing away with that really throws off the total structure of how Rehoboth has built, and I think really isn't equitable.
Okay.
I think,
So-
Noted,
and-
yeah, noted. Yeah.
I think,
you know,
Yeah.
or another way to look at it is, okay, you sort of want all the users to pay a ready to serve fee, okay? So you're charging, and you looked at every possible cost you can attribute to that ready to serve fee, all right? And you divided it among the accounts. Okay? But the thing is, again, we have those big tours, a big, huge seasonal influx. Now, where is their ready to serve fee? Like, we've got 40,000 tourists coming throughout the summer. Now, if those 40,000 tourists were paying a ready to serve fee, great. We'd all be on an equal paying field, you know, if that were happening. But,
Okay.
so I mean, it's, getting away from the peak rate really, I don't know how you'd be equitable if you don't do it.
Okay. Got it. Yeah.
well, I think your point, I think, has validity, because if they're not using any water during 2 quarters of the year, and then the other 2 quarters, they're using a lot of water and we charge them more, that additional rate is justified, that peak rate you're talking about, justifies, you know, or sort of makes up for those periods when they weren't here using anything and not paying anything for the system.
Exactly, right, you have to capture that somehow. And
But if everybody's paying the peak rate during the peak period, that's not necessarily targeting those users that you're talking about.
well, no, everybody's paying, I mean, the people who live here year-round, they're also paying the peak rate, just like the people who are serving tourists would be. So it's fair in that sense, it's equitable, we're all paying the peak rate. But we're charging that peak rate when we have the people who are creating the demand, they're in town. And so we're charging when they're in town to capture the money to pay for the system. Like, they've got to pay for 75% of the system. And if you don't do that, you're just taking the 2,500 accounts we have in town, and you're burdening the cost on those 2,500 people for accounts. I mean,
So playing devil's advocate for a minute. The bulk of the costs are being paid during the peak period, whether there's a peak rate or not, because the use is during that period.
right, but 40%.
And and all those users who are using that are paying.
Well,
But they're not making up for what they didn't use, that's your point.
right, they're not contributing. Those people who are just showing up occasionally, they're not paying a ready-to-serve fee. Here, all of us who are here year-round or own property, we're paying this ready-to-serve fee. These people who are just showing up, they're not contributing.
But who is that person that's just showing up?
It's the tourists.
How are they paying for any of it?
They're paying through.
They're paying it through
They-
whatever rental rate they're paying.
Yes, it's sort of
And
like.
that user that we're billing is here all the time.
Right, but he
So
has to pay for his renters. It's sort of like, it's like he's running a business. These are people running businesses, and they're creating demand, and their tenants or customers creating this demand. And so their customers are creating flow, and we're charging those customers more cost for water during that period. But it's being billed to the owner of, say, the
Right.
rental or the restaurant, okay? Now, so he's having to pay more for his renters, okay? And then he passes that directly on to the renters. He doesn't pay that. He folds that utility cost into his rent. So it's being charged to the tourist.
Yeah.
It's being charged directly to the tourist who's using the water through what he pays in rent or what he pays for his food, okay? And so, because we can't charge those tourists, we can't create accounts for them. How do you capture that? You capture that through their consumption, through the businesses they do use. So, and so you're billing those business people, but they are passing that cost directly on to the customer. So that's why you capture more money in the tourist season, so that you're billing those customers. And so it's a very neat system in a sense. You don't have to bill those tourists. You just keep the same amount of bills. You're just billing those businesses that are who are serving the tourists and using our utility for it.
Okay. No, we got it. We've had that discussion. We have not to this date kind of proceeded in that direction. So, but I understand that that's a position for sure.
Well,
So yeah.
Well,
But we're not here to necessarily solve that for you today.
well, I guess I'm
So,
bringing
yeah.
it up or hoping that you might reconsider and
Okay.
maintain the peak rates, because I think that here when we were voted in to do the outfall and take on that cost, we knew we were going to be having to pay a lot more in our water bills. Okay?
Yes.
We're prepared to do that, but we weren't told that our rate structure would change.
So noted, and I think, you know, if you have, much of this can be found online at some of the other discussions at the meetings. I don't know if you've listened to them, but again, as Kevin said, our charge is to, you know, pass on the best recommendation to the commissioners that we can come up with. The commissioners will then have to decide, you know, where they are with this.
But I would just hope that I know you talked about increasing block billing and things like that.
Yeah.
So I thought you were talking about these kinds of measures for that. I think it's important, having a demand peak fee in the structure.
Noted. Yeah.
I've watched most of the last couple of meetings that are visible online. My concern is, we use about 40,000 gallons a year. There are customers on the same size meter that use 700,000 gallons a year or 1 million gallons a year. And that's loaded in toward the peak seasons. We need to we need to have capacity for those 700,000 million gallon users, and some that are much larger than that on the bigger meters. But should the people who are here year-round, or the small users, have high fixed costs in order to support that peak volume that comes 3 months of the year, 5 months of the year? You know, is that rightly spread among all of us, or should it be concentrated in the usage that takes place in those months? So if my usage is $10,000 per quarter,
So,
10,000 gallons per quarter.
So I don't know that, I mean, well, we enjoy the discussion. I don't know that we're to the point on the water side, because we have.
I'm talking water and
Yeah,
wastewater.
so we clearly went through the process on the sewer side and did not, we are not gonna, unless somebody's changed in the last 2 days, we're not recommending a peak and off-peak on the sewer side. So on the water side, we're in the middle. So we've talked a couple of things. One, we talked a little bit about peak, non-peak. We've talked about this inclining block kind of structure. And we've talked about a flat rate. So I don't know that we've kind of reached a consensus from the team on where we are on the water side, but that's kind of where we are.
And we also said that once we come to more of a conclusion on the water side, we'd have to circle back and see if we were comfortable with the wastewater as well.
Can I
Sure.
comment?
And,
Roger,
yeah, well, just for Matt on the phone, our world traveler is back today. So Roger's,
Right, one of the concepts from the beginning that I thought seemed fair was that the users who are peak, who are generating more sewage, using more water in the season, in the peak season, ought to pay more, but that ought to be tied to those costs that are variable. There are certain fixed costs that, regardless of how many people you have in the system, you're going to absorb them. So the concept, and I think that's carried through in the current version of the way we've been looking at the rates, is to have the fixed cost spread among everybody based on an annual usage. So that somebody using the 40,000 is not going to pay as much as the 100,000 a year. It's going to be scaled based on that. Then there are other costs that are variable, or I think we use the term non-fixed, which are being assigned to the peak usage. So those people who are using large amounts in the summertime are being assessed at a higher, not at a higher rate, but because they're being assessed based on their peak flow, it's a higher dollar value. And examples of peak, variable versus fixed, you got certain employees that are going to be there regardless of the flow at the plant. So those are pretty much fixed costs. Things like chemicals, electricity, some of the design, some facilities are designed for peak as opposed to what would be lower numbers if you didn't have those peak flows there. So my understanding is GHG has been asked and has given their opinion on what parts of the system have to be over-designed, so to speak, to account for the peak system. So even though we're not presenting it as two separate rates, peak and average, the peak is factored in to the rates that last rates I saw. Let me put it that way. Am I stating that correctly?
And Matt can show us if he goes to like the cost allocation table, may give them a better indication of how that actually played out.
What I saw suggested that it was like 85 or 90% fixed and 10% non-fixed. And that system was designed to accommodate summer demand.
I think if you go out different years, and Matt can show us when those new costs come in for the peak, I think those numbers, I think you're right in maybe the first year or two. But then, as I recall, the last version I saw, there's a much greater percentage on the peak, and when you get out a few years, and some of those enhancements to the wastewater system are having to be constructed. But we should look at the actual numbers. I'm talking just in generalities now.
Using the fixed charges that you have listed on that spreadsheet is manipulating the system like I can't believe. Anyone who would say that the pension of somebody who works at the plant is fixed, it's just, it's manipulating. And if you get 85% fixed, it's just the height of manipulation of numbers. The fees there are a few fixed fees, and the 99 rate study really does a great job of explaining that. But most of your fees should be stressing the system. And if you have to bulk up with another oxidation ditch or 3 more people to sweep the floor out of the plant, those are current expenses, and those should be flow-related expenses because the big users are stressing the system, and they're stressing it for everybody, not just some little piece of an expense that you allocate to the plant. And we're really headed down the wrong direction. We're going 85 fixed and 15 flow. It's backwards. And the 99 rate studies explains all that. The 99 rate study also explains the logic behind moving the surplus, moving some surplus, and I'm sure you've read this, Kevin, from the enterprise funds into the general funds. They talk about the need to do that and why that's done. And I could just go on. You don't need to hear me talk. but I'm really upset.
Well, it seems like the plant is built about 3 times the capacity of what the homeowners need. It's built to serve the tourist population, which is easily 3 or 4 times the size of people who typically live here. So I would think 3 or 4, 75% of the overall capacity and operation of that plant needs to be a variable fee that goes into the flow, not be burdened on residents and homeowners. So if you're, so you shouldn't have more than 25% of the cost in fixed fees, and all the rest is in demand from tourists.
Yeah, I think
So-
that logic doesn't hold water. I mean, the physical plant itself, or you just talk the pension. I mean, the employee is the employee, and we don't, he's here all year round. So it's staffed, the staff remains the same, whether he's here all year round. We don't bring additional people on to service the additional flow in the
No, but
summertime.
he's there because he's to address the capacity that the tourists bring. It's the tourist responsibility for that plant as well as those of us who live here. It's they're the primary customer, and we can't bill them directly, so we have to bill the businesses that use the water, that the tourists, use the water through. So, but it's.
Okay. Walter?
Thank you. It came up a few minutes ago, the term that's most applicable here, and I think you have multiple directions to drive, especially in commercial. You don't have the power, you pay a demand fee. But they don't do that in residential, they spread it across. But you see out on the highway, the work that's going on now, because you have to have it there ahead of time. You can add an extra well, but you just can't go mid-season and throw in the 25% addition to the size of the sewer plant. So some of it's fixed costs for long-range planning, but it still needs to be there, or you would have it breaks every year. So when you have, the issue here is not just the tourists, that I don't care whether you have a sprinkler system or you water your lawn or not, I don't. Try to save some money there. But we are also the tourists in the summer too, because we use more, atypically, we use more water just as well as a neighbor next door that might be somebody that's renting from someone else. So what I'm trying to say is we are the people that are also using more in the peak system normally.
And if we pay peak rates, that's fair. I mean, it's just common practice for utilities to face this problem of having excess demand and having to build their capacities for that huge demand, and then having to bill those people who create the demand. Just like telephone. We're old enough to remember when AT&T charged certain rates during business hours, and then you got a discounted rate at 6 p.m., and then you got discounted rate on the weekend. They were having to charge their higher rates during business hours where the businesses were creating the demand. So that's very common.
They don't do that anymore, do
I
they? Okay, yeah.
Well, I think she makes a valid point that we ought to look into, and maybe we've done this, I've missed the last few meetings, so this may have been done. But if we have more employees at the sewer plant because of its capacity, I know a lot of things are automated today, so, it's probably not as many employees as you would have had under an older, more mechanical system. But if maybe we should ask GHD that question, or somebody who would be knowledgeable on that. Do we have more employees there because of the higher flow? And if we do, I think her point stands. That ought to be assigned to peak.
Well, there are no part-time employees at the water plant or the wastewater plant. They're all full-time.
It's all part of the capacity. It's the whole part of having to build a bigger system to handle that huge influx we get in the summer. And so they're just as responsible for the whole thing.
But water and sewer, atypically, the wells might not be checked every day, but the sewer plant, the operations, the lift stations are inspected every day. And sometimes it's gotta be 2 people who are around and doing it. We've actually had problems in the past with a lost person that need extra people, summer and winter, it needs around. You cannot do without the staff to make sure everything's running.
But you might look at it another way. Everybody in town charges peak rates. Hotels charge peak rates in the summer, right? Their rates are, and rentals, they have the highest rates in the highest part of the season. Then their rates go down when there's less demand, okay? So they charge peak. The restaurants charge peak. They've got one menu that's in the summer, and then in off-season, they give specials, okay? So it's common for people in this situation to have really peak rates. Why isn't it fair for the city's utility to also charge peak rates? To capture building something to be able to serve this huge demand that just visits us at that time.
So let me see if I capture the comments in what I think are two main questions. One is the assignment of the fixed and non-fixed among all the costs, the 85-15 that Jay brought up, and the peak versus non-peak rates in both water and sewer.
And the other thing I want to point out is that the charge of your committee is what are all the costs and how are you going to bill and capture the costs to generate the revenue? You're creating that. The commissioners aren't going to get into those details. So that's why it's important for this committee to look at how are you going to raise all the revenue, and that's going to be based upon the rates you recommend, and if you recommend peak rates. So that's a key part here of how you're recommending the amount of revenue and how you're recommending to capture that revenue.
So if I could, I mean, noted that there is some thought out there that you would prefer a peak and a non-peak rate. But I think to get moving,
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't want to hold you.
we understand that there's a desire from some that think there should be a peak and non-peak rate. And I think
if people
make sure we
understand,
look
a
at it.
little tricky, but I think
Yeah.
if people understand it, they're going to recognize how peak rates are fair, they are equitable.
And it is built into the current system.
Right.
Now, whether we've assigned, or I shouldn't say whether the right percentages have been assigned still needs to be determined. But just to comment on your comment, I'm not sure I would agree that a utility should be compared to private enterprise, which is based on, what the market will bear. Utility, let me just finish.
Yes.
My whole premise from the start, and I have no ox to gore in this, I'm about to sell the only property I have in the city, so I can be objective as I can, and that's been my whole goal, is to try to have rates that are as related as we can to the actual costs incurred. And when I started out on this and they said, oh, it's based on the size of your water meter, I said, well, who did the study there that figured that out? We couldn't find a study that supported that. I don't know where it came from.
You're right.
And so my whole concept, and I have a background in environmental engineering as well as law, was to try to make this as fair as we could. So I've been a proponent of having peak built in, and I think if you go through the numbers, and it's not easy to follow, but the numbers are there to show we've accounted for peak. The one thing that I think I take away from your comments is, have we fully considered everything that's related to peak versus non-peak? And I think we have to take a careful look at that. If there are more employees at the plant because of the size it has to be than if it were just a year-round plant, that should be accounted for.
Yeah, I think that would be the way, I appreciate that, and I think everybody wants to be equitable. So I think if you think what would be the size of the plant and all that, if it were based just on property, okay, then how much bigger is it to serve the tourist industry? Then that's how much we have to capture from tourists, okay?
It's not quite that simple,
Right.
because the costs are not all just related to flow. There are fixed costs that you have regardless. So you can't just quite say that 75% of this ought to be on the peak and 25% ought to be on the non-peak. It'd be nice if it were that simple, but that's not an equitable system either.
And I agree, it's not necessarily how restaurants and hotels charge. The real analogy is other utilities. The other utilities commonly charge peak rates. They commonly face this whole problem of having to build excess capacity because of excess demand. And so that's why it's very, very common.
And we have it in the current system. We haven't ignored peak. I don't know, maybe Matt needs to educate us a little bit on how he's factored the peak in.
If the big user who uses 10 times what I use or 20 times what I use pays twice what I use, I'm going to object to that. And I think you're going to be presenting this to the mayor and commissioners. They need to run for office every few years, each of them. And their constituents need to be satisfied that this system is just for them. And if you're loading the fixed costs onto the 2,500 or so meter users relatively equally, and then, oh, there's a slight rise in the summer for the big users. You know, if fixed costs, what you call fixed costs, make all of us roughly equal, and oh, they pay a little bit more because they use 20 times as much, the voters are not going to go for it. They will.
Okay, we need to move on. I mean, we certainly got your position that there needs to be a, I think as Roger very astutely said, I mean, we've taken that into consideration in the analysis. It doesn't show as a separate rate, but it's built into our analysis. But certainly we can, relook the breakout of fixed, non-fixed. Okay, Matt, you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Back to you.
Okay. So Kevin, do you think we covered some of those other topics that we were talking about off to the side? I feel like we did, but maybe I left something out.
I don't see any that we didn't, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so what would be a good next step? You want me to show you some of the changes I've made to the workbook?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through where we are with the water stuff. But I just want everyone to realize that the changes that you may, the things that you may see different in the latest version of the workbook, I'll show you specifically what I'm talking about. Those apply to the wastewater one as well. But we haven't talked about wastewater for a few meetings now, so I'm not going to open that workbook, but I just want everyone to realize that these things I'm about to show you apply to wastewater as well. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what the water workbook would look like if all water customers were charged the same rate. So this is essentially what the wastewater one does, the functionality that's in the wastewater one. But on the water side, obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But still, I want to show you at least what the rate would look like, and then we can take a look at what I've done beyond that, because I did need to make some changes to account for the fact that the city currently charges water customers differently, whether they're in the city, out of the city, whether they're in the Breezewood area. That situation is unique to water. That situation does not exist with wastewater, so I had to make some changes to the water setup in order to take a look at what that might look like. So I'm going to show you those changes just beyond what I show you here. But first, I at least want to show you the fundamental changes to the workbook before I went off and did that other piece. So I learned from working with some people recently on these meetings that I'm only able to share one file at a time.
Right.
So I need to make sure I'm sharing the appropriate file. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's the latest wastewater one. This is before I did the additional work to account for out of city being a different amount and Breezewood being a different amount. So this would be assuming all users have the same rate, which likely won't happen, but it's set up that way here. So here's your cost allocations tab. There's some discussions on this. This is where you would do the fixed versus the non-fixed. This hasn't really changed recently, but this tab is here, and it seems like at some point a review of this information would make sense. It can be done on this tab. The administrative cost tab hasn't changed either. It is used for the ready to serve charge, the setting of the ready to serve charge currently. What's administrative cost and what's not, that hasn't changed. The rate setting objectives tab, here's what I did here, okay? So we started talking recently about the number of bills and validating a number, making sure that that number made sense. Instead of just carrying a number in the analysis, instead what I've done is I've made it a configurable amount. And I mentioned this earlier on the call. So I've added it here. And since the number of bills is heavily tied to how we're calculating the ready to serve charge, and also the projected revenue tied to the ready to serve charge, I've added it to that section. So this row right here is new. It allows you to change the number of bills to any amount. I'm still carrying the number that I calculated, and I have a note here to indicate the number that I calculated. If someone were to change it to someone else, to some other number, that information would still hold true here, so you'd have that as a reference, right? And I highlighted in blue because I have this note up here. It still says number of bills, and we realized that that's actually not really the correct term, as I mentioned earlier. If you get down to the number of bills, this number is going to be 1 to 2,000 lower than what you see here. This really represents the number of meters charged on the bill. Because, as you mentioned earlier, some bills have both a charge for the regular meter and for an irrigation meter. Okay. This section, the flow total section right here, these are new rows. And again, what I'm mentioning to you right now is on the wastewater, it's in the wastewater workbook as well. What flow numbers to use? It's the same concept. These are the numbers I calculated, and I listed them here based on the data set I've been looking at. But these can be anything. You could change these to 5 million if you wanted, okay? And it automatically updates the total number here. So again, it allows whoever's playing with these numbers, playing with a workbook, to get a different number. But it doesn't have to be a different number. And then the only other new thing is down here. I mentioned this briefly earlier, general fund subsidy. Whether to include one or not, this can be set to yes or no. I have it set to yes, but the dollar amount is 0 right now, so really it's set to no, ultimately. There's no dollar amount in there. But if you were to set this, I'll show you where it goes. I've added a row here. This is kind of our projected cost. Well, it's really projected revenues and projected costs, but we use it mostly for projected costs. By year, left to right, the years going across the top. We already have a row for indirect costs, and I'm working with Bert on that number. That number hasn't been solidified yet. Right now we have $120,000 in there per year. This row represents that additional number. So if we go back here, and I have a note here that says if it were to be included, this would be in addition to any indirect costs that we are including. So it's just, if we were to set it to 200,000, it's a yearly number. Now you see it there, every year. And it basically just adds to the expenditure total, so therefore it's included in those projected costs that are trying to be recovered throughout the work.
So Matt, this is Bruce. Let me just interject at this point. Is it reasonable to say that the changes that you've been highlighting that have been added are ways to provide options going forward so that this group can make a recommendation and say, and if you are trying to do something that moves slightly in a different direction to the mayor and commissioners, that here's the place where you can make the calculation, here you can put in the number like the subsidy you're just talking about, so that there are options for that body to consider, so that we're not just saying, here's one recommendation, take it or leave it. It's here's a set of recommendations and here you've got some options.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair statement, Bruce. All along I tried to make this as flexible and configurable as possible, because I didn't want to assume anything per se. Any decision point I tried to make configurable and put up front in the workbook. So, what you just said is very true, and I welcome that, to be honest. At some point, maybe the group gets another copy of this workbook and they can play around with it by setting these different things to see what the different impacts are. So, what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to make a quick copy of these rates. I like to do this kind of as a barometer. So these are hard coded. They're not going to change, right? These are still formula driven. I want to make sure that they change. I would take that back out again. So if we go back to my projected expenditures, you'll see that there. And if we go back to the calculated rate, they're different. So see how this row now is different than the blue row I just highlighted? So that's just one way to show an impact of, like you just said, Bruce, something that's included. That's $200,000 more a year that is worked into here as costs that need to be recovered. So this blue represents the recovering of that $200,000, and the white represents that $200,000 being taken out. So that's just an example right there, Bruce, of what you just said a moment ago.
Right.
Options, different things to look at. But you're right. That's it. That's basically why this workbook has my goal being that it's been flexible. That you could play around with it. You could look at different scenarios and ultimately come up with something that you're comfortable with, or something that you'd like to recommend, or multiple things you'd like to recommend. It's there. It really is a tool for exactly what you just said. Okay. All right. So if we so here are the rates, and I'll just briefly talk about this tab. Some people may not be familiar with it. Excuse me, but this is really where the rate calcs, I guess, the output of the rate calculations are shown by year, going left to right. And as we've talked about, we've calculated both a fixed and a non-fixed rate based on different flow totals. And here's, if you add the two together, here's your total rate right here. So 504 is the sum of those two to the right of it. And then that 1335 represents the calculated ready to serve charge. That's a per bill charge. So quarterly customers would get that amount quarterly on their bills. Monthly would get them monthly. The rows that follow represent different options. I have 4 of them in here. Option 1's a 2-year period. This is the goal here would be, instead of setting a rate that bounces around year to year, the city's been more interested in looking at leveling rates over multiple years, so that there's less jumping around and allows for customers to presumably plan a little bit better because they know that the rate won't be fluctuating as much. So option 1 represents a 2-year fix, so you'll see that the colors are highlighted such that it covers that period. So 2 years of the same rate, there's your 560, there's 560, the ready to serve is the same, 1346, and then it changes in the subsequent year. Option 2, 3 years of the same before it changes. Option 3 is 4 years before it changes. and option 4 is 6 years. So, this is what the rates would look like if every user was charged the exact same rate. We know that's not reality. At least it's likely not to be real. So we've talked last time about making the water workbook better reflect what the city does now, or at least some things to look at for the group to consider for different rates for in-city, out-of-city Breezewood. Now, just as a refresher, the in-city rate is what it is. I have it here if people really want to know it. The out-of-city rate is twice that, and that applies for both, I'm talking about today, in the current scenario, what the city currently charges. And the doubling of rate applies for both the flow-based rate and the service charge. I believe, actually, I think it's called the maintenance fee, the one that's related to the meter.
Right.
That one is also doubled as well. It's not just the flow-based rate. And for Breezewood, it's not twice as much, it's 1.5 times as much. And again, it applies to the meter charge as well. So when we were wrapping up our last call as a group, we talked about looking at multiple options for getting at a rate for the out-of-city and the Breezewood area. We talked about just doing a multiplier, which is what's done today. And then we talked about looking at a cost-based option. Okay? And the group may recall that that one of the things we were looking at last time was how are we going to get at what costs to recover for each area. I grabbed a number that I thought made sense based on some data I was looking at. I was looking at, again, my data set, which is October 2016 through September 2017, and looking at the percentage of billings during that period for each of the areas. So I did a breakdown of what was in-city, what was out-of-city, and what was Breezewood. In-city accounted for, I have it here, about 38% of those billings. Out-of-city, about 60% of those billings. I think I said out-of-city, that's out-of-city. And then Breezewood, about 2.3%. Very small percentage. But we thought, or at least I thought, it made sense as a first pass to take a look at breaking down the costs to recover by those amounts. And that's what I've done and what I'm about to present to you. Again, it doesn't have to be this way. This is just one way to do it. And because it's quote unquote a decision, I guess, a decision point, I made a configurable thing in the workbook. You didn't see it here because this is the scenario if every user is charged the same. So what I did was when I got to this point with this workbook, I stopped with this workbook and then I created multiple workbooks. And you'll see, once I get to them in a moment, where I've done that. All right, so let me get to the right work. Here we go. All right, so here is the quote-unquote in-city workbook. The first step I did as a next step was to take what I just showed you, that water workbook, and create one just for city, just for in-city. So basically try and get at a rate using the same methodology that we've used the whole time for in-city users based on a portion of the cost recover. So here's where I added that, percentage of costs, a configurable number. It can be anything. You can set it to 80% if you wanted to, okay? But for now, I'm using that number that I mentioned a moment ago. This is based on the percentage of billings for that time period I was looking at. And again, a note here that if someone were to change it to something else, they have it as a reference for what was calculated. All right? Now, some other things to look at. Number of bills. Well, it doesn't make sense to carry that full bill amount. What's the bill amount that applies just to in-city? That's the number I came up with, 10,988. The total number was over 23,000. What about flow? Well, we should be able to get at that just for the in-city users, so let's add those numbers in as well. And I put a little note here in red to say modified to be in-city only. All right. So those are the things I changed. And then I just threw the other data down here as reference. I said storage area only. They're not used in my calculation.
When were those dates on that? 2018?
Matt, did you hear the question?
No, I didn't.
The dates on?
When were your peak and non-peak flows calculated? 2018? You have 149,406, and you got 48,201. When were those taken?
16, 17, it looks like.
October 16th.
Because that's like 30
17th.
or 30-some percent, 32, 33%, isn't it?
I guess it's 37 point whatever percent down there.
No, it's not.
Oh.
It's not. It's not. I actually took the data set and added up all the flow for just in-city users. Those are actual flow numbers. It's not a percentage of total flow. I think maybe the last time when we were looking at these numbers last time when we were talking about next steps, I might have just taken the percentage. But since we last spoke, I actually got at the actual flow numbers in my data set for in-city users. And that's what those numbers represent. Okay?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look here. I still have the blue in there. I must have copied it. But those are the numbers I believe that would be carried, like I showed you a moment ago, if all users had the same rate. Okay. So you can clearly see that the rate calculated for in-city based on a lesser amount of costs and based on different flow numbers is different. It's lower, which I guess you would anticipate, right?
Point out what you're comparing, Matt.
That's 1/9.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
What numbers are you comparing?
Oh, I'm comparing this row 5 to row 8. Sorry, the blue again. So the blue, I think I must have copied it in before I made the changes. But that blue should equal the numbers we were looking at in the other workbook a moment ago, which is representative of what the rate would be if all water users were charged the exact same. Okay, so it's kind of it's a good thing that it's just for an eyeball comparative. Those blues aren't actually used in my workbook at all. They're just there for reference. Okay. Everyone okay so far?
If I had to answer yes and be honest about it, I'd say no. I still don't follow what numbers we're comparing. You're talking about the numbers in the other workbook that you closed out for in-city only?
Yeah, so one way to look at it, Bruce, is let's pretend again that the city doesn't have out-of-city users, doesn't have Breezewood, or maybe another way to look at it would
Everybody
all
pays the
users
same.
the exact same.
Yeah, everybody pays the
All
same.
users the
rate
exact
basis.
same. That we're not doing separate rates for separate areas. Those blue would represent what those rates would look like. So because the city does bill those areas differently, we're getting at a rate just for in-city users. And as you can see, the in-city calculations show a rate that's less than what it would be if everyone was billed the same. And that makes sense, obviously.
Meaning the rate in row 5 is less than the rate in row 8.
Correct.
Okay.
This is Roger, and I missed it, this probably came up in the last meeting, but to what extent are the out-of-city users, I guess we're talking about Breezewood, Dewey, what else?
North Shores
North Shores.
and the Route 1 corridor.
Right. To what extent are those higher rates established by contract? I think, Bert, you had circulated some documents on that, although I have to admit I haven't studied them.
Well, the Dewey's a separate piece, because we just sell water. We negotiate with the county, and there have been small increases over the years to sell basically wholesale quantities to Dewey Beach. Dewey doesn't meter their customers, so the county simply bills Dewey for, they meter it and they bill Dewey for the amount of water they use. So
And that's based on EDUs?
it's not, it's based on gallons used. In other words, if we sell them 1 million gallons, we bill them for 1 million gallons.
Right, but they don't meter their individual users.
They don't,
So they allocate that by.
Well,
They
but
do it.
the county actually bills them, and they bill them at a flat rate, an EDU rate.
Okay.
You know, and it's a very good rate, actually.
But when you say negotiate, is there a written agreement that spells out the terms of how that's to be determined?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware of any agreement, formal agreement, but, you know, I know that Mayor Cooper used to, I believe he worked for the county to establish what rate would be acceptable or would be agreeable.
Are there any formal agreements, just in general, for North Shores or Breezewood or Route 1 corridor?
Regarding the multipliers that we use, it's in our city code what those rates are. You know, the Breezewood, the logic behind Breezewood, they pay 150% of our rate, but the logic behind that is they originally installed their own wells and own system. And we, since that time, I think we've even added other wells too. But because they already had the system in place and they came to us, primarily because they wanted us to take it over and maintain it, they were assigned 150% rate. And whereas out-of-town customers are billed at 2 times the city's rate. And again, I don't know whether there's an agreement, Roger, but I just know it's in the city code on how they do it.
But it sounds like there's some flexibility there if the city wanted to adjust it up or down, that we're not locked into something by, well, we're locked into the code, right? I guess the city would have to change the code if they were to make it a different multiplier. Am I understanding that?
That would be right.
But you wouldn't have to modify some agreement with the county or with North Shores or with Breezewood, whoever the Breezewood entity is, to make a change.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much input Breezewood would even have. I mean, that was an agreement, I guess, between the Homeowners Association of Breezewood and the city, and that was just that 1.5 rate has been in play for as long as I'm aware. And well, I guess they came in the 7th. I'm not sure when we actually picked up their service, but the out-of-town rate, I don't know that the county had any input on that. I mean, we simply sell water, so the county wouldn't really be involved in that because we just bill them at 2 times our rate. And I think the logic behind that is that the city owns the system and they're responsible for the debt. It's general obligation debt, and that all they are is a customer. And on the water side, there's justification there because the Tidewater rates are even higher than the rates that the out-of-town customers pay at 2 times the city's rate. So maybe that implies that our system's fairly efficient as far as the water system, because we can sell at 2 times our in-town rate and still give them a good deal.
Well, I can see the logic. I mean, the city's having to take the risk of, use part of their budget, their general obligation to build things, and taking the risk if there's repairs or some other issue that comes up. They're just using the water, they're getting the water.
Right.
Without paying for any other city service, as I understand.
That's pretty much on target.
So there's a logic to that, and then I guess the question is, should we consider sticking with the same multipliers that are in the code? Is that seen as one of the things, maybe I should ask the mayor, is that something you want this group to look at, or is that more just for the commissioners to evaluate?
I would think the multipliers are fine. Are fine the way they are.
You mean stick with the ones we have?
The multipliers,
The concept or the actual numbers?
the actual numbers.
Okay.
May I speak to Roger?
Sure, yeah, Jim.
The 99 study, here I keep going back to the 9, but discussed that. They could not find the order, they do not talk about the origin of those numbers. But they were in existence before they did their rate study in 99. And they made an examination, just like you're asking, to decide if that was a fair multiplier or what the right multiplier should be. And they went through all the logic and calculations of the reasons for them. And they decided at that time that that was a fair multiplier. And so they kept it. And I think that's the reason we've kept it since then. And Bert's right. That's exactly what, if you compare what they're paying for what they pay for Tidewater, they are downhill in the shape. It's good. And that's
Well,
what I know.
that begs the question, I guess, although maybe the mayor's saying that's not part of our charge. Is the multiplier high enough? And is the fact that we have different multipliers for different out of town entities?
Yeah. And as Bert explained the day you weren't here, they had their own well at the time, and there were several factors that went into it.
Well, the Breezewood issue, and I guess one of the questions that comes up is, okay, Breezewood contributed their well many years ago. And, you know, just as a counter argument, they could say that, well, that's been fully depreciated now, and, or we could say that, and therefore we can charge you 2 times rather than 1.5, because the well that they contributed 30 years ago
Is that well still functional, and has it had to be upgraded?
Well, there have been additional wells put in. I'm not sure whether I think their well, I think, was on Strawberry Run, which is inside the Breezewood development. I'm not sure whether we added another well inside there. There is one on Warrington Road, which is maybe 300, 400 yards down the road, on going toward Plantation Road.
But the city installed that one, right?
The city installed that one.
So I'm really thinking about the rationale, going back to when the 1.5 was established, which was different than the other out-of-town users. If the rationale for that was, oh, well, they're providing a well that the city doesn't have to build, right, I can see some logic there. But what you're saying is that well has been depreciated. Maybe it's had to be, renovated. Do we know any of the details of whether that well is even still active? And
I think the well is still active, but as far as what we
2,
have
I
had
think,
to-
6 and 7 are both physically within the Breezewood designation.
But only one was there when we started, I believe. I'm not sure about that. But I guess what I'm saying is, do they still, and I don't know the answer to this, do they still justify having a 1.5 time rate after all these years? And I don't know, that's a topic for discussion. I mean, okay, they contributed their asset 35 years ago.
right.
And you asked the right question, is it still in use? Well, I guess if it's still in use, I don't care what the depreciation schedule says, it's still functioning and must have some value. So, I don't know.
But wells, you know, over time have to be redeveloped, is my understanding. I can't speak to that one specifically. They don't just go on forever.
No,
And six, one I think is the original one out there, right? The one over by the playground?
yes.
Right. So that's scheduled for renewal next year.
So maybe if the city's already had to renew the oldest one, you know, there's a justification for, and that probably doesn't generate that much to the bottom line here, I'm guessing, because that's Breezewood's a relatively small area. So.
Yes, only, I don't think there are 200 people. I think there's more like 100 and some housing units there. But it may be that there is a written agreement that fixes that 1.5 times forever too, and then all bets are off.
Mhm.
So, and I don't know whether that exists. I guess we could explore that.
So I think the question I still have is for the mayor, because we're functioning at his request. You want us to not deal with that, leave it as is, or should we be making any recommendations on that?
I don't see any reason to change the multiplier on out of the city. However, with the exception of Breezewood, given the nature of what you've just discussed, it's probably worth being consistent with everybody outside the city two times. And I would think, you know, depending on if there is some kind of a legal agreement that's signed in the file somewhere, you know, if that's there, we take a look at it. But otherwise, I would think we've got a specific reason for doing it because we're about to replace the old one. We put a new one in there. Just the system's different, better, modernized,
Right.
and depreciated on the old side.
So Matt, do we have the ability to work that into the workbook? Is that already in the workbook to change the multiplier on,
Yeah, so I've already taken that into consideration and done some things around that. So why don't I show you what I've done and then you can comment on whether you think it's on target or not.
okay?
If that's okay with everyone.
Yep.
I know we're getting to the point we're kind of running low on time though, so if you probably want to leave a little bit of time towards the end of our session to talk about next steps and all that. So I'll go quick because I know we're getting up against it a little bit. So this workbook that you're looking at right now is just the calculated rate for in-city users only. Okay. I did the same methodology for out-of-city and Breezewood, where the workbook is designed to recover the costs allocated to those areas. I'll quickly show you what that looks like. So this is out-of-city. That percentage represents the percentage of billings, just like the same methodology I use for in-city. And here are their rates. Now, you would expect it to be higher, for sure. So again, compare row 5 to row 8. Row 8 represents what it would be if all users were charged the same rate. So that'd be in-city and out-of-city being charged the same rate. Considering in-city users showed a rate less than the one in blue, you would definitely anticipate the one out-of-city showing more than what's in blue, and that's what we see here. So for comparison, in-city I had is 3.44 for FY20, 4.21 for FY21. That's compared to 7.14 here for FY20 and 8.68 for FY21. Actually, that represents about double. That's interesting that it actually worked out to be about double. I didn't realize that when I first looked at it. It's slightly more than double. The calculations are actually telling you that, which is pretty amazing, actually.
Are you we're not seeing you flip between
That's
spreadsheets if that's what you're doing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
keep forgetting that.
Right. So
Yep,
we're still
you're
looking at the
right.
city only at
My apologies.
344
My
versus
apologies.
504.
Yep. Yep. Sorry about that. Now you see a different one?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is Breezewood only?
No, this is out of city only.
Okay, out of town only.
Yep, so 7.14 number right here.
Yeah.
Compare that to 3.44, which is what the in-city was. It's
Right.
about double, which is pretty amazing. It's slightly more than that. And that's the case as you go outward to the right. It's pretty much the same thing. Okay.
Yep.
Breezewood, I will share it in a moment. $5.63. 6.4. Oh.
So a little more than 1.5, but a little less than 2.
Right.
And that's
Close
based,
enough for
that's
government
based
work.
on one, that's based on using 1.5 times, is that what?
Oh, actually, no.
Based on cost.
Based on,
Based on recovering costs.